This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner, the Center for Audit Quality, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Hi, I'm Scott Cutler, Executive Vice President with NYSE Euronext, and welcome to This Week in the Boardroom. Today's show is a report on shareholder activism, and I'm joined here today by our third time back, James Copland, who is a Director and Senior Fellow with the Manhattan Institute Center for Legal Policy, and really oversees the Institute's corporate governance website, proxymonitor.org. And from what we understand, for those people that aren't familiar with proxymonitor.org, it's a great website. It's a great resource for understanding proxy proposals. You look at the top 200 institutions and you look at their proposals and you collate the data, and the data is made available in formats that are easily downloadable. And so the focus of really today's show is actually looking at a report that you just put out on the 2012 proxy season, and I know that you released the report last week, and in fact I think our co-host TK Kerstetter moderated the panel reviewing the report, but I'm sure that my explanation doesn't do it justice. Can you take a second and describe the report?
Sure, absolutely. And our report, first of all, thanks for having me here, Scott, and thanks for TK doing a fantastic job moderating what we had a real crackerjack panel last week when we released the report. But the report is really focused on shareholder activism, but of a certain sort, and it's the sort that really derives from the data on our website. So we have data on shareholder proposals as well as the say-on-pay votes now mandated for companies under Dodd-Frank, but it doesn't really encompass the whole subset of shareholder activism. So a lot of us, when we think about shareholder activism, we think about KKR or Carl Icahn or Bain Capital, now much in the news. That sort of shareholder activism isn't on our screen. It's not under our purview. And by and large, that sort of shareholder activism, while it makes things uncomfortable for managers and boards, it's something I think is generally a good thing, because folks are putting up a lot of their own money and trying to shake up companies to increase share value. This sort of shareholder proposal activism that we focus on is quite different, because any shareholder who's held stock for a year in a small amount, only $2,000 of stock, can introduce a shareholder proposal and try to change corporate governance through shareholder voting. And that's really what we're focusing on in the report.
But it seems as much as we focus on and talk about shareholder activism, it really is a very small group of shareholder activists that are driving a lot of the agendas on these proposals.
That's absolutely absolutely correct. And one of the main things we found in our report is only 1% of these proposals are being sponsored by institutional investors that aren't tied to organized labor or don't have an express social policy or socially responsible investing type investing paradigm, and a plurality of them are backed by labor pension funds. The socially responsible investing funds are another big share, and then among individuals, about 10% of all proposals are backed by individuals that are outside 3 individuals and their families and family trusts. So other than labor pension funds, the next biggest group of investors filing these are Evelyn Davis, John Chevedden, and members of the Steiner family. And those folks introduce about a third of all proposals, just 3 individuals and their families and their family trusts. So it's a very small subset of investors that are launching most of these proposals.
Give us a sense for the scope. How many of these shareholder proposals actually receive a majority backing of shareholders?
On average, this year it was about 8% of the proposals got backing, but there's a significant variation, and obviously it depends on the type of proposal. So proposals to declassify boards of directors so that you have annual director elections tend to pass. About 5 and 6 of those pass on average, looking back through 2006, which is what we can do with our data. Majority voting proposals about half of those pass. They tend to be fairly regularly passing. On the flip side, the more socially oriented types of proposals, those involving human rights or animal rights or the environment or political spending or things like that, effectively never pass. One of them has passed over the last 7 years at a Fortune 200 company. So they're very rare that those are going to get majority backing.
Right. One of the other interesting things was some statistics, maybe the first time statistics about ISS and the percentage of time that ISS supports certain proposals, and how that contrasts, quite frankly, with the number of proposals that receive majority shareholder support. And I thought those statistics were interesting.
It's a striking disconnect in terms of what ISS is saying and what shareholders on average are saying. One of the things we did was something that other people have done before, which is test how much influence ISS is having. And at least with our data set of the Fortune 200, we saw that once you control for other factors in an econometric type of analysis, ISS on average bumps up the shareholder vote 15% for shareholder proposals and about 17% when it comes to when they oppose a say on pay proposal. It knocks down the vote there about 17%. But when you look at the actual majority pass rates, you see a striking disconnect. So I said 8% of the shareholder proposals got majority backing on average. ISS supports 63% of all shareholder proposals across our entire data set back to 2006. And when you look at say on pay votes, on average 1.5% over the last 2 years of these have actually failed, where a majority failed to back management's pay plans. ISS, on the other hand, opposed 13% of all the executive compensation plans. So you see ISS systematically favoring a lot more shareholder proposals and opposing management's pay a lot more often. And so one of the things we asked when we were doing the analysis in the report is, well, why might that be? I mean, why does ISS still have a lot of influence, and why is it so different from the average shareholder? Well, when you look at ISS's actual business model, it's not hard to figure out. The social investing funds and the labor union pension funds are big clients of ISS. They're their customers, and they're the ones backing most of these proposals. And so obviously ISS wants to be a little more solicitous of what they're saying. So ISS is backing 35% of environmental proposals, which never pass. They're supporting 70% of all political spending related proposals, which only one has passed, and that's when management actually supported the proposal. So there's a big disconnect there, and it's totally a function of that. Now, well, why do the other funds hire ISS? Then is the question if they're disagreeing with them. Well, the answer is because basically the government tells them they have to. The big funds do it because they want the information ISS can give them. So when you look at the Fidelities or the Vanguards who are doing their own independent analysis, they buy ISS's information, they're not relying on it. But there's a lot of smaller investors that effectively are doing whatever ISS recommends. And the reason is they don't get a lot out of voting in the first place. For the same reason why we have ignorant voters in general elections, the return from being a better voter if you have a small sliver of the company's stock is effectively nil. And so they want to invest their scarce resources in trying to maximize the returns on their portfolio and keeping their costs down, not in being a better, more informed voter. But the government tells them, the SEC and the Department of Labor for the pension funds says, oh, you have to cast a vote in these shareholder elections, when the shareholder voting items, that's part of your fiduciary duty. So the way they handle their fiduciary duty is basically offloading it to ISS. So ISS is systematically having an influence, but also systematically biased in what it's saying.
Interesting. Well, there's been, I call it a little bit of noise. Maybe it's because of the political season about political spending disclosure, and the report essentially says that shareholders don't see much of an issue there. Is that right?
I think that's basically the case. It doesn't mean that boards aren't paying attention to this, and these types of proposals get more support on average than a lot of these sort of social issue proposals like animal rights, for instance, or about the same as what the environmental proposals tend to get. But none of these proposals have been getting majority support, again with the exception of one at Amgen 7 years ago where the board supported the disclosure proposal that was introduced. And what we've actually seen this year is a decrease in support on average for these proposals, so that they're only on average getting 17% support overall. Now, some of that's due to the fact that you've seen even more aggressive proposals being introduced. So some of these proposals aren't merely disclosure, but they're saying we want a shareholder vote to approve political spending, or we want to prohibit all political spending. Those are obviously getting low single-digit numbers, and that's explaining a lot of the variation year on year. But we're not seeing a groundswell of support here, and I think it's because the average institutional investor or the average individual investor who's paying attention to such things, to the extent people do, is sitting there and saying, well, if my interest is maximizing share value, I'm going to trust the managers and the boards here, give deference to their business judgment. We don't want to tie their hands on what they're disclosing and what they aren't. Obviously, we want them to comply with the federal rules and regulations, but beyond that, we're going to trust our managers to do what's best for our interest as shareholders, rather than trying to direct this through the shareholder process, which is basically what we've also seen, by the way, now that we have mandatory say on pay. As I said, 98.5% of these are getting approved because shareholders are basically saying it's hard for us to evaluate what the right pay scale should be. We're going to defer to management most of the time.
Well, with low single-digit shareholder proposals receiving broad shareholder support, what does this say about the future concern or issues around proxy access? How do you see that as a trend evolving into 2013 and beyond? I mean, it was a hot issue 2 years ago, less so this year, other than the fact that clearly shareholders have a much stronger say what's happening in the boardroom, but it really doesn't appear in terms that many of these proposals are getting broad support.
Right. In fact, the percentage getting support has fallen in recent years. Now, we actually test for that, and it's not a real-time trend once you start controlling for other factors. It's really partly due to the fact that the proposals that were getting more support, getting majority support, a lot of them, the companies have basically mooted the proposals. So when it comes to the Fortune 200 companies, boards typically are going to be declassified now. A huge percentage of these companies already do have majority voting for directors. And so these types of proposals that were getting more support in the past, they're just not being introduced as often because the companies have effectively changed their policy.
They're baked into most proxies now
the flip side of these rules, and I don't express a strong opinion on these rules, but there's certainly some empirical evidence when it comes to takeover context that declassified boards have value for the shareholder. The flip side is, of course, when you have the elections happening every year for directors and majority voting required for directors are a little bit more on the hot seat. And so that allows these other types of shareholder activists to sort of exploit some of this situation that's going on and potentially do things that are in their interest but may not be in the interest of the broad majority of shareholders.
Well, my last question is, are there any other issues that you think coming out of this report that might be interesting to the board members or directors that are tuning in?
Well, the other issue that I think we really focus on here is the role of the labor union pension funds. And we actually look at the companies they're targeting with their shareholder proposals, and we see that they tend to be companies that are actually performing well in terms of stock price performance, but there's some other reason why labor funds might be after them. And a number of companies that are being targeted in union organizing campaigns are getting multiple labor union pension fund shareholder proposals. Now, the labor union pension funds aren't supposed to be doing anything other than maximizing the value of their portfolios. That's the federal ERISA rule that they're supposed to comply with. But both the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Labor as well as the DC Circuit have questioned whether in fact they're doing that. So I think directors need to watch what they're doing, but as a general rule, I think directors need to be sitting there and saying, what's in the fiduciary interest of the shareholders that I'm representing? Because it's far too easy to say, well, I don't want the headaches, so I'm going to sort of play ball with, cut deals with these minority shareholder groups that are pushing these agenda items so that they won't come after me in a director election, or they won't make my life more difficult. The flip side of this is, and what our report makes very clear, is that if you've got 70, 60% support even for management's position, ISS and some of these groups are going to say, well, that means that you've got a problem. Well, why is that the case? I understand why you want to make all your shareholders happy, but if 60% or 70% of the shareholders are saying we're against what these guys are pushing, why should you be selling out the interest of the majority of your shareholders for this small special interest, whose interest may be deleterious to the average diversified shareholder who's interested in stock price returns? So I think directors need to keep that in mind and to some degree hold a firm line, even if it makes their life a little more difficult.
How do people get a copy of the report?
they can go to our website, www.proxymonitor.org. The report's there, my prior reports are there, and lots of information, including a database of all the shareholder proposals at the Fortune 200 dating back to 2006. So people can look up these questions and make up their own minds.
Well, James, it's been really great to get an update on the latest in shareholder activism. Thank you for tuning in this week. If you haven't had the chance, we do have October 3rd through 5th coming up, the annual Boardroom Summit and the Board Peer Exchange here in New York. And so we look forward to many of you participating in that event. That's it for this week, and we hope you'll tune in again for issues that will help you become a better director or board committee chair. Thank you.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner, the Center for Audit Quality, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.